you for giving that good presentation, Wadi'h. I have a couple of questions and a couple of real quick. Firstly, can you repeat the person who suggested to you? I must have just not quite heard. Workers of the world unite consciously. What comrade was that?
Yes. So she's a leader in the CPC. She was at the Academy of Marxism. For several years, she headed the World Communist Movement department at the Academy of Marxism in Beijing. And
Okay.
and her first formulation was Workers of a World Unite. First step is Communist Parties of a World Unite. And then a few years later, she added consciously to the formulation. Um, so, meaning that um, essentially the task of a communist party before a revolution is to represent the common interests of the working class, regardless of nation. I'm taking directly from the manifesto. After a revolution, the task of a communist party is to represent the common interests of the working class, regardless of nation. That hasn't changed. Mind you, now it has immensely more power, and it has capacities and resources, um, but it was extraordinary. And again, it tells you that there remains a strong party consciousness within the Communist Party of China. Much of it is absorbed in government tasks, and one of my recommendations is relative separation of party from government from unions. But that was the formulation. That was what she had to say.
Okay. Thank you. I understand that now that it was a comrade in the CPC, and and just on top of that, I would like to say I'm so happy that that we've been able to have international meetings like in Greece. I believe it was about 2 years ago, and also that our comrades, uh, John Bechtel and others, went to China, and that's been fascinating to me to hear the reports from John and these comrades. Uh,
Yes, I have organized that. Yeah.
okay, thank you. Well, and secondly, I'd like to ask, I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions. Could you give an idea, since the Waltons are not the power behind the decision to make Walmart a mega corporation worldwide? What are the families that you say, and just you don't have to name a family because I mean we can't even imagine, but how does that power manifest itself besides the great wealth that the Waltons or Jeff Bezos or these other main characters have accumulated? Can you explain what power it is that's larger than these wealthy individuals in
Yeah.
general?
Good question. So, um, in in his work on imperialism, Lenin correctly identified. It is important actually to name names. Basically, two families as dominant. Uh, the first and larger one at the time, when Lenin wrote 1916, was the Morgan family or Morgan group. The second one, rising, uh, was the Rockefeller family and 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 those associated with it. So, um, in any event, so that's 1916, um, and um, Morgan made a huge mistake as capitalists go. He was so busy making money, he had only one child, Junior. John D. Rockefeller had a lot of children. And just like the feudal royal families in Europe, very carefully married the children, above all, into banking. Um, in all the big crises up until and into 1929, uh, J.P. Morgan would come in, often take over treasury, but essentially take over management of key state uh, uh, institutions, uh, uh, essentially to, above all, to protect his belongings. And so then Victor Perlow, who was the chief economist of the CPUSA, I had really the pleasure to work with him and his wife Ellen, who just died 4 years ago. I think she was 103. But
Wow.
in any event, um, essentially one of the great contributions Victor Perlow made, among many, was to follow who owned what and their connection with the state. So this is something that it's important to realize. Essentially, FDR served the Rockefeller interests. And so with the rise of FDR, basically, Morgan understood that he faced a mortal threat. And so to give you a sense, again, of the relationship of forces and changing, Morgan then sends one of his servants, a DuPont, a billionaire. So part of a way to see this, crucial for us. Okay, so you see 1916 on the left side. So, so on one side is the Rockefeller family. On the other side is the Morgan Group. And families as wealthy as the DuPonts are, so it's a much smaller, it's subordinated specifically to the Morgans. The Dodge family, various Boston families, largely subordinated to the Rockefellers. There were some corporations that were essentially areas of combined control and rivalry. So, but General Electric, obviously J.P. Morgan Bank, AT&T, U.S. Steel, the Council on Foreign Relations. At the top, that ellipse, U.S. state apparatus, no one family controls the state apparatus. But like Lenin pointed out, two families are dominant. Along comes the Great Depression in 1932. And is essentially, again, critical to understand, FDR essentially was an office boy for the Rockefellers. And Morgan understood the threat. The famous event that happens in during the transition, before FDR came into office. So after his election, but before he's inaugurated, essentially, as in previous crisis, someone suggested maybe that J.P. Morgan could be brought in to help manage the crisis on behalf of the capitalist state. And the response from FDR, no one from 23 in my administration. 23 was 23 Wall Street, the headquarters of Morgan's Bank. So this is really important, again, because for Marxists, control of the capital and not least of the state apparatus is crucial. So essentially, and again, Victor Perlow, very courageous and very meticulous work. If you went to his office, which I did many times, he had these bookcases to a ceiling that must have been 14 feet high, and with a ladder to reach him. But he had the annual reports of every major corporation in the United States, and again tracked who owned what and who was in control. So then you see essentially that control going uh, uh, switching from two families to one group being dominant. And uh, so uh, Chase Manhattan, one of the prime properties of the Rockefellers that they married into, now called J.P. Morgan Chase, and often just called J.P. Morgan, is obviously one of the major pieces in this. Citibank, which had been an area of conflict between the two, again, unmistakably dominated. Um, on the right side, under the Rockefeller Group for current, you see ExxonMobil, Chevron, Texaco. So BP Amoco, so BP used to be British Petroleum, um, merges with Amoco, Standard Oil of Indiana, also Standard Oil of Ohio. It unmistakably becomes a Rockefeller-dominated corporation. Schlumberger, which does critical work in oil exploration in particular, was a French corporation. You follow using Victor Perlo's methods, it unmistakably becomes a Rockefeller corporation. And so, University of Chicago, founded by the Rockefellers, you see the control. The Council on Foreign Relations was organized initially by the Morgans in the wake of the crisis of 1907 and World War One. It gradually, the Rockefellers take control over that. And so somebody like Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, who got on the Rockefeller payroll when he was a graduate student at Harvard, is now one of the dominant players. But also critical then to understand is that essentially one group had taken control over the U.S. state apparatus, which then protects its properties. And so you see, the Waltons and Walmarts are one of the subordinate groups. Bill Gates began to think that he was a big somebody. If you remember, and this was typical for the state to do, including with the Morgans, they sued him. The state sued him and humiliated him. And after that, Bill Gates understood his station in life. The wealthiest man in the United States at the time, quote unquote. But don't you dare have any illusions about who you are. The Kochs, I think Joe calls them the Koch brothers. Again, 37 billion each, supposedly. One of them died in the past year or so. But in any event, part of they would like to be able to control the state apparatus, um, and so that's again, this is part of the whole picture, and that was part of a calculation between initially challenging Walmart management. So, well, Rob, you probably got more than you asked for.
No, that was very specific, and I appreciate that. I was very interested. I'm glad you had those diagrams.
They're part of a series of diagrams used in China to understand, again, in part, the world situation and, above all, the fall of the Soviet Union. I'll take you quickly. Um, uh, so then this fills in again with what we were speaking about. The Soviet Union accounted for 21% of war production in 1988, just before falling. The United States accounted for 23%. So mighty building. But the building is standing, as you see, on one column, which is effectively the government, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the unions, the equality organizations, all under one discipline, entwined under one discipline. And I have the base as a, in part as a result, because of this, is quite weak. And then you have an unfolding storm. And wow, was there an unfolding storm in the capitalist world through the 1980s? essentially that typhoon brought down the mighty Soviet Union. Also have a very thin line marking currency. Currency is very important after socialist revolution. Currency pricing for a variety of reasons, and you can see where currency was inadequate. Uh, by comparison, this is partly Cuba was also hit by that same typhoon, and I'm just pointing. So, uh, for a variety of reasons, the Cuban state standing on three columns. One of them is government and party entwined, which is a weakness. But for a variety of reasons, including organizing by helped by the CPUSA of unions in Cuba, but there was some relative separation between the unions and government party in Cuba. There is. And also very interesting is the women's federations in China. Also, there was some relative separation between them. Currency in Cuba also a huge problem. It's a very difficult but very important problem after socialist revolution. Nevertheless, so the Cuban state was damaged by the typhoon that brought down the Soviet Union. It's hardly out of danger, but it withstood the typhoon. Um, uh, the Soviet Union did not. So again, some of the work in China has been this comparative analysis, which I'm pressing now because this pandemic is like a big stress test on the Chinese state and the Vietnamese and so on. The pandemic and uh, all the balloons that it has exploded. But in any event, uh, uh, also in this diagram in light blue, as you see, essentially the base uh, is of the state is the working class, domestically above all, but really the international working class. So in any event, um, um, the point is again, these are working class organizations. If you lose your base, the state is in trouble. And a lot of what prepared me for uh, what I hope has been useful work in China was to study previous stress tests that of states formed where capitalist rule had been overthrown. Hungary, 1956, Czechoslovakia, 1968, especially Poland, 1980, 81, and the rise of Solidarnosc. And uh, in any event, again, there's a leadership, there are leaders in China that I would place on the party side of party government in China that are responsive and that led to that organizing of Walmart and all Fortune 500 corporations in China.